And welcome to the Agronomists, everybody. I'm your host tonight, Shaun Haney. Really looking forward to the discussion here this evening. It's going to be a lot of fun. We got a lot to discuss, and I've got two great guests, but I will say this, we are facing major adversity, but we're going to get through it. I absolutely promise. I'm also challenged by a bit of my voice as it comes from talking here all day here at Real Agriculture. Okay. So it's the Agronomists. We're talking about sprayers, spraying, and everything in the vicinity of that topic. We've got two great guests, Tom Wolf of Agronomists, Jason Deveau of Omafra. Together, they are Sprayers 101. Really looking forward to talking to the spray guys tonight. Remember, you can get CCA credits for watching tonight's program. Go to realagriculture.com/agronomists. Sign up for our newsletter, and we'll send you a notification when that's up and ready, usually on Tuesday morning. So we learn, we have some fun. That's what the Agronomist is all about. So I mentioned adversity. There's a little bit of a touch of it, just a smidge. Don't worry, we're going to get through it. We've actually got one of our guests tonight on the phone. Tom Wolf will be on the phone. But let's bring in first here Jason Deveau. How are you doing, my friend?
Very well. See, I care enough to have a camera and a mic, unlike some of my colleagues.
Hey, I can hear you.
Oh, preparation. Oh, he's on.
He is here. Yes, he is here. So Tom, tell us where are you and what happened?
I'm in Drumheller, and tomorrow we have the first of our regional meetings for the grain commissions in Alberta, the wheat and barley, pulse, and canolas. And there's bad weather, so I'm here early. But there was a power failure before I arrived, and they have no internet here, or I can't get it on my phone either, so I'm calling in.
Well, hey, it's great to have you. So one of the challenges we have with the phone here is that I appreciate Farmer Schneck mentioning it. I am trying to deal with it. When Jason talks, there is going to be a bit of an echo. I know how to fix that, so don't worry. I just have to mute our side here. So we'll take care of it. I promise. We'll try to get through these technical difficulties, and we'll make it all work. So as I said, welcome everybody. Appreciate you all being here tonight for the Agronomists. We're going to have some fun and learn a little bit as well. We'll start with Tom. Tom, you spent the summer doing a lot of research, keeping up to date on everything that's happening. The big issue this fall has been discussion about actually next year, and that's supply chain issues. And this isn't really that kind of a show, but it does have a bit of it does play a role in obviously what we're going to be doing this coming spring when it comes to spraying.
It's huge, Shaun. It's sort of the supply chain issues sort of trickle down all the way to the agronomy level, and actually the supply issue, of course, is with herbicides and other pesticides. And if we have a shortage, what do we do? And that's something we have to start thinking about right now, because if we obviously have a weed control need and we haven't got product, that's sort of a problem, and we have to hopefully be able to mitigate that before it happens.
Yeah. So, Jason, from your perspective, when you think about some of the potential herbicide and pesticide challenges from a supply standpoint in front of growers for 22, what do you think of in terms of growers have to get their minds wrapped around when it comes to actually hitting the field?
I think it's going to be really tempting, Shaun, to start nibbling away at what I consider to be minimums. And I'm going to pass this back to Tom in a second, because I'm sure he's going to agree with what I'm saying. People are going to be tempted to use less water, maybe to use less product, maybe not to tank mix actives that perhaps they should. It's interesting. I've spent a lot of years working in horticulture talking about getting the right volume and the right rate. And I am an advocate for making changes to rates and water volumes, but not in field crops. The margins are far too slender as it stands, and they're already working with as few drops as I think is practical. So this is not something I would advise, but I'm pretty sure Tom's got an opinion on that.
Yeah, Tom, what about that? We ran a story on realagriculture.com, I think it's a couple weeks ago now, about the dangers of cutting rates. Jason, though, mentions water volumes as well. Thoughts?
Well, I mean, if you can't get the product, what are you going to do? And I mean, that's why I think it's important that we talk about it right now. And basically what we're talking about is Liberty and glyphosate. Those are very, very big products. If we have a cropping system or a crop plan that relies on those two products, we're going to possibly be in the bind. And so right now we have to think about maybe making some changes to those plans and being slightly less reliant so that we don't have to put that much effort into getting those products. So think about other crops, think about crops that for which herbicides are likely to be more readily available. Think about crops that are very competitive, that might be able to do well without the herbicide. Like, I'm thinking of oats, Oats are currently priced quite nicely, actually. And what do you need in oats? You obviously can't spray a group 1, but maybe a broadleaf, 1 pass broadleaf, and that's about it. Oats are also nicely suited for the other problem that's in the back of my mind, which is, of course, the price of fertilizer and sort of the likely reductions in use as a result of that pressure. That really also means that the crops, whichever crops we do grow, are going to be slightly less competitive early on when we need them to be competitive to compete with the weeds. The herbicide anyone's ever going to have is a competitive crop. And if we're knocking one of those legs from under us, then we have another problem. So it's going to be a tight one. I think I would think very seriously about what I'm going to grow next year and opt for those ways out.
Tom, John, I'm going to put the question here on the board. John asked, wouldn't you be better off to use no Liberty or glyphosate than a reduced rate? Reduced rates just promote resistance, don't they, Tom?
Exactly. No, that's 100% correct. And that's just the issue. So here's in terms of resistance, there are a number of different kinds of resistance, but the metabolism-based resistance, if it's possible, well, I should maybe overstep my knowledge bounds here, but there are some kinds of resistance, some kind of weeds where we actually select for the resistant biotypes by cutting back on the rate. The ones that just make it through that reduced rate are the ones that will then set seed, and their offspring are going to be a problem for either later on that season or next year, and that's what we're trying to avoid here. So reductions in rate are not advised. So whatever you do, make sure you apply the full rate if possible.
Jay, the best part about this with Tom on the phone is he can't see all of the comments he can't see all the audience comments and how they're raising some questions about why he's not on
I'm enjoying them.
Ain't about me, guys. Come on, let me know.
Well, your good buddy Ray says, Tom raised his voice saying fertilizer. Remember, Ray is retired. Peter Johnson says, well, Tom, oats win on both counts, need less herbicides, needs less fertilizer, last of the cultivated weeds. There's also questions here about maybe Tom is facially hair challenged and doesn't want to have to take on Jason. There's also a comment here. Don't worry, Tom, it's not all for you. Peter Johnson says, Jason, are you auditioning for Kris Kringle? 'Tis the season, Jason.
Peter, you've been talking to my wife? She's been calling me Santa Claus for days. Of course, what she wants for Christmas is for me to shave this rat off. But as long as I'm running in the cold, this is a real cheap way to stay warm. So it's going to stick around a bit longer. Tom, let me ask you a related question. Since we're toying with the idea of rates, how do you feel about increasing water volumes as a form of compensation? I know I heard you loud and clear. Don't mess with rates. Find an alternative. But there are still going to be some that think, well, okay, maybe I'm willing to carry a little extra water, dilute it a bit, and see if I can't stretch my herbicide dollar a little. Or maybe it's time to finally listen to Tom Wolf and slow down and drop my boom and get all those errant droplets working for me. Do you think that we've got some kind of margin there, or is it an absolute drop your foot, don't mess with rates situation?
Well, that's a great question, because we are talking about the effective rate, really, is what you're getting to, and that is how well is this product going to work. So this means that let's say that we cut back. Let's just say we cut back 10%. how do we make it work as though we hadn't? And we can. I actually think we can. And here's how. I mean, there's a couple of basic rules of maximizing your herbicide performance. Let's go over them real quick. The first rule is make sure that your water quality is good. Make sure you haven't got a water issue that might antagonize the herbicide performance. And of course, this is important because we had a drought in Western Canada, and I think in Eastern Canada, I think you're going to be okay. But a lot of water sources that seem to be good, for years before might no longer be good. So testing and make sure that you condition your water before you spray. So that's step number one. Step number two is it has to do with nozzle selection. Some herbicides, they'll work with a coarser spray because the rate's there. But if the rate isn't there, now we have to start saying, okay, we can't really afford any loss of efficiency. If it's a grassy weed, if it's a contact herbicide, if it's even a group 1, we're going to have to spray with a finer spray. Let's talk about just the other factors, the uniformity side. We get these peaks and valleys in any spray distribution. Even a pool type sprayer will have those. But in fact, the slower we go and the more water we put on, the less those peaks and valleys are going to affect us. So those are all good strategies. Jason, you mentioned cutting back in your water volume. Well, it's true for some herbicides. Less water works better. Glyphosate is the best example. It gets hotter the less water. Yeah, it gets hotter the less water you use. So, I would go through those basic fundamentals and make sure we do everything right. But let me add one more, and that is early removal. When the weeds are small, when they're most susceptible, that's when they're easier to kill. Let's spray then. It's not so much about getting every last emerged weed and waiting for the last one to come up, but rather making sure that you give the crop a chance to establish, removing the competition as soon as possible so they don't rob yield. And then if some weeds come later, let that happen. It's okay. It's mostly cosmetic. The yield's already been protected by the early removal. So those are ways, I think, that we can get some bang for the buck out of even a slightly reduced rate.
Here, Jason, a question here from Jason Vogt out of Manitoba that I'll throw your direction. If crop protection products are tight for getting the right AI, active ingredient, to the weed, is there a benefit to using surfactants, NIS, MSO, etc.?
It's really great that you asked that question, because that was going to be the next thing I posed to Tom. In the last few years, I've started to pay more attention to additional surfactants beyond what the formulated product already has. And let me say this, we have always said, or I've always said, you really don't need to add anything to the tank that the label doesn't ask for, because the registrant has already put what's necessary in there. But I've been slowly reassessing that, because rates and water volumes are meant to handle a whole range of conditions, and the registrant can't possibly know what situation you're in. They have to put products in there that can handle, be a little more flexible. So they don't necessarily put as much in as they could. Also, they don't want to spend extra money on those adjuvants, and it affects things like shelf stability and a number of other factors. So I'm seeing a lot of work coming out of New Zealand where they have been adding adjuvants, contact adjuvants, to great effect. Now, where I work in horticulture predominantly, I've been looking really closely at organosilicones. They're called super spreaders. And they look like you're watching Venom at the movie theater. You put a drop on this leaf and it just creeps and creeps and creeps. As long as there's humidity in the air, it'll cover an entire surface and even wrap around to the back of a leaf. Now, I wish I could say go throw that in your tank right away, but there are a lot of caveats for that. In this case, it actually causes phytotoxicity. Not a big problem if you're after a weed that you're trying to kill, but there are a lot of unexpected problems with adding too much surfactant or the wrong surfactant. So I guess the bottom line is, if you consider that a strategy to improve coverage, find a dealer that's done it, find someone that has evidence that it does improve matters before you just chuck it in the tank and hope that it works.
So
yeah, I totally agree with Jason on that one. I mean, it's the number of possible mixtures out there for different groups of formulations and modes of action and the number of so-called activators, you can definitely go wrong. I mean, you wouldn't want to add a crop oil to a glyphosate or Liberty. I mean, there's very defined things that you should not do. But, I think the label is still going to be our guide. If there's an aftermarket product out there that makes a claim that it will heat up your product, make sure you see data for the active that you want to use with that adjuvant, and make sure you see it on the weeds that you have, because it is, in fact, that specific. You can't go wrong.
Jason was very happy with, appreciate that question, Jason. He said, great response, Jason. Awesome. Okay. I have another question here, Jason, I can't find it earlier in the stream here, but I'll just kind of sum it up. Okay. So if there's a shortage potentially of products that I would like to use or I could use, this is kind of the scenario where we maybe see some, I don't know, we got a pretty educated audience here on the Agronomists, but I think it goes without saying, we should probably bring this up. People selling stuff like formulated in a 10-gallon drum, like, hey, I've imported this fancy new product from Israel, or, in Australia they use this, and people are willing to try anything to attempt to potentially kill a weed. We need to be very, very careful.
So let me say on Sprayers 101, we've got a great article that I wrote with Mike Cobra about tank mixes and unknowns. The first takeaway is our PMRA, Health Canada, does a fantastic job, however slow and irritating sometimes. They do a great job making sure our products work and that they're safe. And if we have to wait sometimes to get at those products and we don't always agree with some of the limitations, so be it. We really are very lucky to have them. And I don't work for them, so I can say that. Get a label from the PMRA, use the Control F function. Before you start tank mixing, that's fine. Look for the word mix, look for the word don't, look for some of these key words. That's to speak to Tom's point about not adding things willy-nilly. Labels will tell you when you don't add things. Here's another fun tip. If you start spraying things that aren't registered and somebody decides to test residues on those crops or watch you a little more closely, you could end up getting into a whole world of hurt you don't want to be in. I am not a fan of products that travel across the border secretly. I am certainly not a fan of snake oil that falls off the back of a truck. You're risking a lot, not only your crop, but who knows what's in there. This goes all the way back to the guy that sets up a truck in a small town offering these curatives and is gone the next day. Don't be tempted by smooth talkers, unless it's me. Hear you, Shaun.
I had myself on mute. That was sort of like the medicine wagon, where the guy would roll into town, right? And he would have all these potions to help you solve all your problems.
That's it.
He gone. Okay, we got a question here. Tom, this one for you. Gord asks, can low volume, high concentration spraying as used by drones be effective?
It can be, but it is very much product specific. There are a few products that work better, as I said, at low water volumes. Glyphosates are pretty well the poster child for that. Most products can tolerate things going down to 5 gallons, but they don't get any better. They then get possibly worse. And of course, there's a whole group of products for which we should never reduce water volume because they rely on coverage. You know, the Reglones, desiccants. Liberty is a very good example of that as well. Mm-hmm. Now, we have seen Liberty work very well at low water volumes in some cases, but it's just not consistent. And there's always, in our data sets, we've seen Liberty work really well at 5 gallons. And I know people who use it at 5 gallons and say, yeah, it works. But Liberty is a very complicated product. And most of the time that kind of strategy fails. So I would say it's not a general rule of thumb, but 5 gallons is probably safe for most products if you're okay with using a finer spray. The finer spray will do the job for you and cover your coverage side. But the issue for me really is does it affect your window of opportunity? Is it going to be too windy, too hot, too dry? That kind of a thing. That's kind of why I typically have stayed away from the finer ones.
Jason mentions that there's a zillion companies coming out with additives and things to be added. It's hard to draw the line on what's potentially real and what's not. Peter asked a related question. Is there any central repository for information on what adjuvants to add with what, or what definitely should not be done? Is PMRA and the focus search the best that we have? Do you want to grab that one, Jay?
Yeah, I'll touch this one. So the short answer, Peter, is no, we don't have any single third-party repository that tests all these possible combinations of adjuvants and actives, or more importantly, adjuvants and formulations. There was a great publication that came out of Purdue a few years ago. I was lucky enough to be involved with that, where they give a lot of the basics about all the products that can be added to a tank. The power of the water droplet is what it's called. And you look that up on Sprayers 101, there's a link. It's a free download. And it talks about how adjuvants work. It classifies them. It also warns you to look for certain seals of approval. In Canada, any product that's registered for a crop has to go through, the gauntlet of testing. In the US, the strategy is more, if it doesn't work, you're just not going to buy it again, and it's self-correcting. But adjuvant companies, recognizing that they weren't all perhaps above board, they do have a voluntary seal. I can't remember what it's called at the moment, but the adjuvant has to pass a whole bunch of criteria, quality assurance really, to assure that it works as it's advertised to work. So that, I think that's the best we have at the moment, at least on the United States side, if you're looking for any kind of formal category of adjuvant and what it can and can't do. Otherwise, yeah, they're just all over the place out there, and they promise to do everything. The words plant health seem to be stamped on everything. Sure, it doesn't kill weeds and it doesn't kill bugs, but it has all kinds of secondary value to plant health. Sounds a bit too good to be true.
But, we have a really great regulatory system here. I mean, some people complain about it, but we have the PMRA, and they are protecting our farmers in a way. And here's how. They say, we want to make sure that products on the market actually work. We are going to review the data. So if you're going to market an activator product, and those are the kinds of products that are surfactants that say heat up a product, they say before you can market this in Canada, we want to see the evidence from field trials that it works. And you have to produce that evidence for the same, eco zones that you have to produce efficacy data for herbicides. So it's a significant research effort. It's one of the reasons why we don't see a proliferation of products here, because the evidence may not be that easy to obtain. It's costly, and the market may not bear that, give you that return. But I like the approach because it keeps the confusion out of the marketplace. The products that clearly work well, they're out there and we can get them. And the ones that don't can't be registered here. They're not registered here. Now, in the activator side, that's true. In the utility modifier side, now these are your water conditioners, your drift retardants, your pH modifiers, those kinds of things. That's a bit of a gray area. They just have to prove that they actually change droplet size and thereby reduce drift, or they change pH and thereby improve solubility. And the problem is that sometimes in marketing, those features are sort of extended over into the activation side. And they say, wow, this product reduces pH. Sure. And thereby it improves performance of your herbicides. Well, no, that doesn't follow, not necessarily. And so we do have to be careful and read between the lines about what they're claiming.
I've had a few people message me and say, hey, we can't see Tom on the screen. Do a better job of producing this show. And I'll remind everybody that Tom is stuck in a hotel somewhere in Alberta without internet. So he's calling in via phone, but we greatly appreciate him doing so, even though we can't see him on the screen. But, Jay and I are having a good time with all these comments. Ray points out that Dr. Hook and the medicine, I think it was the medicine woman, wasn't it? Isn't that, no? What is he talking about?
You don't know Dr. Hook, Sylvia's mother? Come on, man. Rocket Chief Perfection in 1975.
All right. So Jason's pretending he was born in the 50s. Ray actually was, So, Dr. Hook.
I can appreciate solid music, man. Ray, I'll say this. So Tom talked about activators. He talked about the different classes of adjuvants. There's one of the fluffy ones that falls in the middle called a deposition utility modifier, which spells dumb. And I always kind of enjoyed that. And they made all these, usually when you see deposition utility modifiers, they're what Tom's talking about. They'll just do everything for you. They're pure magic. We tested one that was supposed to stop runoff completely, which I imagine it was just full of molasses and honey. It was the stickiest stuff I've ever seen. So we tried it in a trial. It happened to be an air blast sprayer in an apple orchard. And I'll be damned if it wasn't fantastic. Everything stuck. We didn't get a single drop more than 2 feet into that canopy. It worked exactly as advertised. So this is a lesson that just because the product does do what it's supposed to do, be sure that you actually want it to do it. As it turns out, that operator did not spray trees from both sides. He was a lazy bugger, and he only tried to spray from one side so he could cut his passes in half. So we ended up just sort of lambasting one side of the tree and not getting a drop on the other. So when we tested that, we said, you should put this on the label, not for alternate row spraying, it's called. Well, I've seen that product, and that's not there. So be careful what you ask for sometimes. This is a real slippery slope.
Tom, you were going to say something?
Well, I was just going to say, it sounds like it was that probably was so sticky on the foliage that you said it never went beyond. It never had any canopy penetration, in other words. So he actually shot himself in the foot by doing that.
Mm. For those of you that are listening to the podcast of this show later on, like we're all live right now, but in a couple of days, people are going to listen. They'll be like, "What is going on?" The live chat is humming with people talking about their favorite Dr. Hook song. So.
Well, When You're in Love with a Beautiful Woman is a great song. And I have seen Dr. Hook live, and that like Dr. Hook, he must have been 80 when he sang, but he was still good.
Well, John, he says, I had the opportunity to see Dr. Hook live about 15 years ago. Best concert I've ever been to. But the question I have for John, is that the only concert he's ever been to? Because it's like,
Next thing you know, I'd like to see some comments on David Gates and Bread. Another band of that era.
Oh wow, I have no idea what you're talking about now. Okay, so what is another question here? Got to get through all the Dr. Hook stuff. Michael asked a question that here. This is the audience. Now we're getting technical. So Jay, I'll throw this to you. Which is more important, droplets per square inch or gallons per acre? For example, 1,300 droplets per square inch at 7.5 grams per acre, or 900 droplets per square inch at 10 grams per acre. Go for it.
Michael, I'm going to make our friend Peter Johnson smile. This year at the Ontario Ag Conference, Peter wants Tom and I to talk about coverage. And coverage for someone who sprays is one of those topics that just puckers you right up. It is so difficult to define what's better, a dilute application, a concentrated application, a high droplet density, a low droplet density. There's no easy answer to this. It depends on the mode of action. For example, let's say you've got a contact product and you spray that contact product in a very concentrated spray, and you decide that you don't want to use a whole lot of water. That's the concentrated part. And you get one big fat drop in the middle of a leaf. The odds of it coming into contact with what you're after depends on if it's a mobile insect, or maybe it's sessile, or it's a spore that's not going anywhere. So the definition of what is good coverage in that case is a slippery slope. Let's take it further. You sprayed a very concentrated product, which means it's a big, fat, thick ball of it. And as it weathers and we maybe get a little precipitation, it actually ends up being more rain fast than if you had sprayed dilute product. So it'll last longer. So now you've got a product that's got longer lasting activity, except it's still not great coverage. So is that really better than spraying dilute product over more surface? The answer is it just depends. You have to know your pest. You have to know your mode of action to try to find that combination. And let's take it even a step further. Maybe that pest is under the leaf. So now you have to use very fine droplets or finer droplets to get them to change direction and get under there, unless you're already spraying from that direction. And maybe we'll talk about that a little later. Then coverage becomes a whole other thing again. It's not an easy discussion. I think we get a little off the rails when we just talk strictly about droplet size. It's a very powerful thing, but ultimately it's a bit of a theory. We're assuming that if you have smaller droplets, you have more droplets, but we really don't know if they're going to arrive at the target. We don't know if they're going to be completely dried out by the time they get there. So maybe the potential benefit of a lot smaller droplets over a larger area isn't ever realized, and it just becomes drift and waste. It depends. I would tell somebody on the West Coast spraying the same crop as somebody on the East Coast, I would give completely different coverage advice to based on how dry the air was, how windy it was, because of the survivability of the droplet. It's the government answer, man. I'm sorry, but it's not something that we can just give you a threshold. If it was, I wouldn't have a job.
Yeah,
Tom, what are your
Jason,
thoughts?
I mean, I think I think that what you're trying to say is that the droplet density per square inch does give you some idea about performance, but it has to be in the place where the uptake or where the pest is, right? So the gallons per acre, that's the parameter that gets you there. So it's if you are looking at an early season herbicide where the canopy hasn't closed and the leaves are displaying their cotyledons and their first or second leaves, those are easy targets. That's where even a low volume can deliver the 80 or 100 drops per square centimeter that's required for good coverage. But if you're spraying, later in the season and you have to get further down to the canopy and the canopy basically intercepts everything before it gets, further down, the only way to get that droplet density further down is in fact with water volume. So I think the droplet density, and then the cool tool really is water temperature paper here. You put that at the target height and then you use whatever water is necessary to get the required density at that height. And more water will always get you more further down.
Okay, so the audience, I was wondering when we were going to kind of get to this, Jason. I think the audience has sort of taken us in this direction. John, there's two questions I think I'll ask them both at the same time. So how far away is the sprayer that can coat both the bottom and the top of the canopy for total protection? And Jason adds to that, so what about nozzle positioning when it comes to what your target might be in certain crops? Jason, why don't you go?
Shaun, tell me you set this up. You had to have set this up. That's impressive. Just a little trade secret. Before we do these shows, Shaun appears knowledgeable because he is tremendously. I don't know anyone that knows as much about agriculture as this guy. But he still needs a little prompt every now and again. And he knows Tom and I well enough that he needs some security. What are you guys going to talk about? And please don't swear too much. So I told Shaun that I wanted to talk about a study we just did in corn. And when I say that the results are fresh, I mean, I was changing the graphs this morning. And I got to say that the results of this have shaken my faith in some suppressant fungicides. And I'll explain that. So I don't get to do a lot of efficacy work in field crops. I do lots of things with coverage and sprayers and physics, for sure. And as I've said, I spend a lot of my time in horticulture. But to do a full efficacy trial in a field crop is still a fun new adventure for me. And I've got a buddy who doesn't know me well enough to know he shouldn't have let me do it. We were testing coverage in corn. 2 years ago, David Hooker and Albert Tenuta and I had a sprayer rodeo where we tried a dozen different forms of spray application in the hopes of finding one that would give us superior coverage in the silking region of corn. And that's where we get things like Western bean cutworm and gibberella and other ear rots. So it's really important we get good coverage there. And I'll pad my nest a bit and allude to the ending of this story, we really only have products that offer suppression. And if you go to the PMRA and look at the definition, control means 95% kill or control of the pest. Suppression means you're going to knock it back enough that there's a positive economic impact if you do it right. But it's a pretty fluffy term. And in the case of fungicides, we all know timing, water volume, coverage are king. And little things like nozzle selection, while important, come sort of last. So back to the corn, we did find a method of application that doubled the coverage in what is, like an 8-foot deep crop. That's a heck of a trick. And it wasn't overhead broadcast, and it wasn't planes or helicopters. It was the humble drop hose. Now, some of you may not know what that is, and some will just shrug and go, they don't work, they're ancient, so it's old, it couldn't possibly work. Well, just because it's old doesn't mean it doesn't work. A drop hose is a form of directed application. What it means is instead of having the nozzle spraying over top, you have a hose that hangs down between the crop, and the nozzles are positioned to spray from within the canopy, sideways in this case. So when we did this with the Y drops, which guys in corn will use for side dressing, there's a little nozzle body attached in the middle, and it just makes a cloud of spray right in the middle of the crop. And boy, statistically, it was twice the coverage, twice the active ingredient deposited. And we thought that's amazing. But coverage doesn't necessarily mean efficacy. That's a bit of a trap. We all think if we can get more product there, it's going to work better. Yeah, quite often it will to some degree, but not always. If you jump up and down on a bug and kill it, well, it's dead. You don't need to keep jumping on it. Perhaps you may already have enough product there. So this year, we did it. We used 2 different fungicides that I won't mention, and we sprayed in corn with the drop arms or the drop hoses, broadcast, and a no spray check. And this was 1,200 acres. So this wasn't a small plot. We had 10 reps. We had 3 treatments and 10 reps. And we got the yield data just last week and learned that using those drop arms, we ended up getting like almost $30 more a bushel compared to the no spray check. And that was really great news. What surprised us is that if you sprayed with a broadcast application, which most growers do if they're not flying it in, they lost $5 an acre. So that gave us pause. Wait a second. How did you lose money spraying fungicide? The timing was the same. And the answer we think is coverage variability or lack of consistency. Those products that were already, we'll say, soft, didn't get where they needed to go in sufficient numbers to protect the crop. And as a result, it didn't pay to spray in that case. Now, with the directed application, the drop hoses, we used a special new one out of Germany, out of Agrotop, called a beluga, because it looks like a whale. It's very streamlined and it goes right through the corn. That thing paid for itself in 300 acres, which was phenomenal. So while we were slapping ourselves on the back, thinking, wow, this is going to change how we spray corn, we went one step too far, and we did mycotoxin testing. So if you've got something like an ear rot, gibberella, for example, if it's happy, it's going to leave behind a bunch of byproducts, toxins. And if they build up sufficiently, they're going to reject those at the grain elevator. Cows won't eat it, pigs won't eat it, makes them sick. We don't want it. And a few years ago here in Ontario, we had a problem with it. So while we got a great yield and these things paid for themselves, the mycotoxin numbers came in this morning. They were all over the place. Half that crop would have been rejected if anybody tested it. And it didn't matter what treatment it was, control, broadcast, or directed application. Some of it looked great. Some of it looked awful. We were just knocked back on our heels. It becomes a complicated story, and I started to get a little concerned. We all know that these fungicides in field crops, they're 10 years that we've been spraying these seriously, and people are starting to do it now as I must spray fungicides at this point. And for certain products, yeah, you must. And it's all we have, these suppressant products. You've got to get it on there. But I'm wondering, just how much it's doing for us sometimes. Like in wheat, we've got dawn cast, we've got ways to determine when it's time to spray. In corn, we don't. And guys are putting it on there assuming it's doing a good job. Some years it does, some years it doesn't. I start to wonder about these suppressant fungicides in field crops. In horticulture, we can spray every week and a half because fungicides have a certain rain fastness and they're prophylactics. They have to get there ahead of the disease, and as the leaf grows or it washes off, we spray more. We're not going through soybeans or corn more than once, and yet we expect these products to last 3 or 4 weeks, and they're not curatives, they're prophylactic. I'm starting to wonder about this process, and it's surprised me that I would even doubt this. So I'm going to throw it out there. This is all real fresh. I haven't even written this up yet, but I'm having a hard time justifying those applications based on what I saw.
Follow-up questions here based on what you just said from Farmer Schneck. How long were the drop pipes? What nozzle was on it? As well, 15-inch spacing with still a front-back nozzle over the tassel. Can you answer those?
Yeah, I can hit those. Ooh, and I'm echoing, so you get to hear me twice. Okay. The front and back nozzles and broadcast twins, we tested those in different forms. You can go to Sprayers 101 and see the work. Holy cow, it's Tom Wolf.
He's here.
I'm stunned. It was stunning to see him. I'm back though. If you go to the work we did 2 years ago, we showed which nozzles we tested, and honestly, it was just a mass of who cares. The only competitor that pulled out were the drop hoses, and that happened to be the 360. The homemade drop we used really wasn't designed very well, and we alternated it with broadcast, so I don't count it. The Beluga was 60 inches long. We put 2 nozzle bodies on it, and they were spaced, so 210-degree air mixes, which if I had my time back, I wouldn't have used air induction, but it still ended up to about a medium droplet size. They gave full 100% overlap coverage in the silks and in the corn ear, that region. Well, I can't remember. What else did you ask?
Hold on here. We had how long were the drop pipes, what nozzle, and then 15-inch spacing with still a front-back nozzle over the tassel?
The drops were on 30-inch, so between each row, 15%, 15-inch spacing still from. Yeah, we did them over the tassel. Didn't see any difference. We even did them 2 years ago. We alternated these custom nozzles that we had made that were 40-degree and 60-degree flat fans. We tried to drive the 40 inter-row right between them and hoped it would run out of momentum and just start spinning around in there. And I'm telling you, we saw no difference. The only difference we saw is when you release the spray from inside the canopy. And if you consider that, that spray only has a few inches to go. It doesn't have to drill down through 9 feet of canopy, which filter it as it goes. And because it's still moving very fast in there, I wish we had gone a little finer. We could have taken advantage of all those fines. They're not going to escape, so let's let them loose in there. We got underleaf coverage on top of the leaves, all over the silks. It was gorgeous. And yet, with that superior coverage, we had enough mycotoxin that half that crop would have been turned around and they would have had to drive back the next day in a different colored truck to get tested again. We won't talk about that, but I know what people do.
So, Tom, you have yourself muted. There you go. Okay, we got Tom Wolf on the screen. He is here. So big round of applause for Tom. Hey, Tom, throwing in the deep end here. Jason asks, is there any data research that Tom has seen with similar results to Jason's that he just talked about on Western Canadian crops like wheat, canola, etc.?
Can you hear me? Am I in? Excellent. I have a bit of an echo on myself, but I'll speak. We don't have similar data, Jason. We just don't have that, that predominance of corn for which the drop tube is really designed. And, I'd love to see that in some of our denser crops, some of the edible beans that are highly valuable. We've been using a little bit of air assist to try to get down there, but we really don't have the drop tube infrastructure. And we really need to have some maybe development of technology there. I just would say right now, our big tool is still water and uh, and maybe we're fortunate we don't have the disease pressure that Ontario has for corn, that we don't need to maybe use the late season fungicides.
So I got a comment here from Pete. So Jason, what he says is one challenge for Jason's scenario: low disease pressure in 21, unless you were in tar spot area, and tar spot was late. So different diseases will need different spray techniques. Different years may give different results. What are your thoughts on that, Jay?
Well, I agree completely, Peter. This is even though it was 1,200 acres, so 1 acre size plots, and they followed a lot of topography, and they would have crossed a lot of different pressure areas, and disease can be very specific. We did not see a lot of tar spot, and we did scout for that. We did see a lot of pink tips on the corn, so there was a lot of gibberella, and Albert, helped us along with that. We did all the scouting we were supposed to see. We're going to do it again. It's not enough to just do 1 year. And even though the numbers were real, I mean, this grower walked away with an extra $30 a bushel. There's no arguing that. The stats weren't significant. So I can't say with any confidence that this would work for a neighbor. And I can't say with any confidence, certainly not 95%, that this would work the exact same way next year. But to not even see trends in the toxins, and to have Albert Tenuta say, tell me you saved some of that corn, because that's some crazy numbers and I want to test it. Who did the work? And we said an accredited lab with an ELISA test, which is far superior to what they're going to do at a grain elevator. I had an amazing moment of silence from Albert, and that was, that's telling. So we do need to do this again. But, before I throw all the data under the bus, and before I throw suppressant fungicides under the bus, it is hard to argue with the yield. These beluga drops, economically, they cost about $200 US a piece. And the only competitor that's commercially available is the Y drop equipped with an undercover 360. That's $1,000 US a pop. And they are so heavy that you can't fold the whole boom out. It's only 60 feet. So you've lost half your productivity. You've dropped $1,000 on each of these. And not to say they don't work, they work spectacularly. But there is perhaps a more economical choice. And before we tried it in corn, we did it in onion. Tom, if you guys want to try drops in some of the snarlier crops, I've tried them in soybean. Unfortunately, once they close over, you tear the heck out of them. I've done it in ginseng. It causes so much damage to the crop. So it works beautifully with vertical crops. Corn, I did it in onion. There's a few others you can play with. It gets a little tricky working with field crops, especially on a 120-foot boom and rolling land where, you're going to drag one end and pop the other up. So there are some, yeah, I read that. Yes, Peter, I won't tell you who my cooperator was, but he was so thrilled when he saw the jib data and said he felt so vindicated. And pretty much is exactly what you just said. He said it's so frustrating and hard to figure out for a grower to recognize when it makes sense to spray and when it doesn't, when it's economically viable, and to have done all the right things and still get rejected. That frustrated me. I can't imagine how he felt.
Okay, I want to make sure that we get to some of the new sprayer tech. Tom, I know you wanted to give us an update on what's happening in the area of green on green, green on brown, that kind of stuff. I'll turn it over to you.
Can you hear me?
Can for sure.
Yeah.
We just lost you. Tom left. Tom?
Still see him. You cursed it by asking if we could hear him.
Yeah, we could hear you, and then you...
Can you hear me now?
Go for it. Yep.
It's the classic thing to say in the Zoom era. Can you hear me now? Things are moving faster than I expected. So we've had, since we last spoke, how long ago was that? Was that 6 months ago? We've had a commercial release. You can actually buy green on green for a sprayer. It has to be an Agrifac and it has to be in Australia, okay? But it will actually spray wild radish out of a canola crop on a green on green algorithm. It'll cost you $8 per hectare to do that. But wow, they're talking about 90% accuracy on that right now. So it's a reality, and they're developing algorithms that will cost a certain fee per hectare. That's kind of their business model. It's kind of like what we call the inkjet model. You buy the inkjet printer for next to nothing, basically the hardware cost, but the money's made on the user fee, and it's a reasonable fee because there might be $8 a hectare of value in removing that weed, which is a difficult to control weed in Australia. The other one that's exciting is green eye technology. This is a little Israeli startup, and I've sort of been watching them, and I've consulted with them over the last couple of years, and they have released their green on green unit for commercial release in 2023 in the US, 2022 in the US. So they're moving fast. We'll see how. We don't know yet about their acceptability in the market, but it's happening, and I'm totally excited about it.
Jason, what kind of with the increase or the I guess the improvement in the technology of green on green, like where does this take us? Like like we used to talk about this like far into the future, but it seems like it's becoming closer and closer to reality.
I get calls weekly now, Shaun, where this was just a few nerds with pie in the sky even 3 years ago. Uh, Now it's weekly. I get calls, people asking about where we are with this technology and where we can get it. I'm part of an autonomous agronomics working group here in Ontario, and we kind of cover everything from RPAS or the UAVs all the way to cute little R2D2s that drive along at night scuffling away. But this green on green, it's going to change everything. It's going to stretch our pesticides. It's going to reduce resistance if it's used correctly. It's going to allow us to use multiple modes of action. And best of all, if it's tied to autonomous units, it's going to cut back on a lot of labor. It's even going to let growers find the optimal windows to spray if it doesn't matter. That doesn't take a person behind the wheel. For me, again, I keep making this a Hort thing. We are hopeful that we're going to get 3 autonomous air blast sprayers that can spray effectively green on green. They're going to be used a little differently than you would in a field. But the beauty of this is now we get a new feature taken out of the hands of the operator and put into an algorithm, and that's travel speed. Travel speed play a big role in coverage, certainly when air is a component. So they're using algorithms to not only to detect that there is a target, but the density and the nature of that target, and adjust their speed and perhaps even water volume, or if we get far into the future, direct injection. It's crazy how many of these technologies are coming together.
And I don't think it's just for green on green. I think it can be for a lot of different things. I listened to a podcast the other day where they talked about artificial intelligence, and really it's machine learning in medicine, and they taught an algorithm to predict the pain felt by a patient based on an X-ray of a joint. And so think about not just visually whether you can tell a weed in a crop, but you can for example in biology you can tell a certain kind of seed from another. For example, in the Palmer amaranth world, it's a dioecious plant, so that it has male and female seeds. They can tell those apart with AI as well. They can train these algorithms to be really, really accurate. Think about, Jason, think about what it could do for us in terms of learning about time management during the spraying operation. And if you feed the algorithm things like, look, this is my hour meter and this is what I was doing, maybe the learning algorithm can make suggestions about how you should be spending your time, or maybe a better use of the order of spraying a certain farm, that kind of thing. There's a whole bunch. It's like a fresh set of eyes on old problems, right? And that's how I view machine learning.
Tom, what do you think about the open source in Australia? I'm only learning about that now, but there's always a group that want, to raise the bar for everybody for free, and I'm all for it. But now we have open source algorithms for plant ID.
Yeah, it's fantastic. So fellow behind that is Guy Coleman, and he is a student at the University of Sydney in New South Wales, but he's actually currently in College Station, Texas, and he's doing his PhD down there. He has developed what he calls the Open Weed Locator, which is an open source, do it yourself. Currently, it's green on brown, but it'll grow to green on green device. He uses a Raspberry Pi, and he teaches you what diode to solder to which wire, and he has the databases to teach it how to recognize weeds. And you can basically build your own. He's done it, and he's taught you how to do it yourself. This is going to be fantastic. I always think about Brian Tischler, who's obviously a big part of the Alberta ag, movement. He's done the open source steering and sectional control, and he says, "Look, here it is." Yeah, very, very cool.
Tom, which is there a crop type that maybe benefits the most from green on green technology getting to real commercialization?
Wow. I never thought if there was a specific, I would say the ones that of course are most, least competitive and most dependent on full removal of the weeds, right? I mean, so we're talking perhaps about the flaxes or the lentils, early season crops or late season crops that have serious susceptibility to weed infestation in the early growing stages. Maybe that's the bang for the buck. But everyone's thinking not about crops, but they're thinking about weeds. So everyone's trying to find the magic solution for palmer amaranth, right? So all the algorithms are focused on palmer for North America, just like they were on wild radish in Australia. They're going after the big guns.
Jason, any thoughts on that?
Let me give you a different way to think about it. So I'm in a privileged role where I get to see research applications, which is always awesome because I see cutting edge ideas. Some are pretty far fetched, but some are amazing. And all the crops that I'm seeing in Ontario where we're testing robotics, where we're testing green on green, green on brown, any kind of ID algorithm or alternate form of weed control, they're not in the field crops. They're in the specialty crops, where they're incredibly labor intensive. For example, our muck crops here in Ontario, that would be things like onion, carrots, they require crews of people to go out and manually weed. So that's tricky and grueling enough as it is. And you certainly can't hire anybody locally that's willing to work that hard. You throw COVID in on top of that, when labor became something we couldn't rely on, and we didn't want people in close proximity even when they were here. And it sets the stage for smaller units that can control weeds and identify those weeds without the need for people to be in gangs and groups doing it. And from there, we end up with planters, and we end up with something very much like swarm farm. Just imagined a bunch of very small dots, And I see that's where we seem to be putting a lot of our focus and energy out here right now.
So
what do you think, Jason? I mean, do you think that having a whole number of lighter, smaller, more agile units is, the swarm farm idea, less compaction, perhaps even less capital investment? Does that
absolutely
promise?
Absolutely.
Are we going to see a completely new type of machine?
I hope so, and I'll tell you a couple other reasons why. With more units like that, your window for spraying, if you get enough of them, gets smaller. They can all operate at the same time. If one goes down, there's always another one, and they tend to be simpler and lighter. Now, I did mention the Holland Marsh, the muck crops. The reason we do a lot of hand weeding out there is that ground just won't tolerate big equipment. So frankly, it's not even an option for large equipment to do that. It seems to be driving the technology. It's not just one small autonomous platform I'm privy to. It's half a dozen, completely different, all with different potential means for weed control, from lasers to scufflers to, pulse width modulation. Just pick your poison. And when we're looking for alternate means of weed control to stretch our pesticides and make weed control viable into the future, these alternate methods, these cultural controls are key. I'm very excited for what the future holds.
Okay,
Dude,
so
100% agree. That's so exciting. Yeah. Sorry,
Jane,
Sean.
well, I just want to get to this. Jane asked a question about green on green, green on brown. What is the possible windows for weed resistance with this kind of technology? And then Francois Tardif says, I'm afraid Palmer is so adaptable that it will learn to evade green on green. Tom, what's going on?
Yeah, so this is I like the first question a lot because it's true. What we're doing with green on green, green on brown is really, I believe, we are simply extending the utility of our herbicides. We are not solving a problem. We are just prolonging the inevitable, and the inevitable is resistance. We're exerting selection pressure on the resistant biotypes by spraying herbicides. The very act of spraying does that. What green on green and green on brown allows us to do is to use the mode of action tank mixes that Jason already mentioned, the multiple effective modes of action that are currently cost prohibitive because it might mean 4 different herbicides for a single weed species. 2 of which the weed may already be resistant to, and the other 2 which provide at least 2 additional modes of action that prolong the utility of those remaining 2. So that could be a $30, $40, $50 tank mix, $60, $70 tank mix, who knows? Green on brown makes it affordable. Green on green makes it affordable. Inevitably, though, Francois is right. These, especially metabolism-based resistance in Palmer amaranth, is so adaptable and so powerful in basically wiping out a whole swath of our tools in one fell swoop, that ultimately, if you have a Palmer that is resistant to the modes of action that you use on your farm for those crops, and you can get all of your weeds, but you can't get that Palmer biotype, what use is your herbicide system? Because you're going to have to do something cultural for Palmer. And that is the inevitable sort of destiny of herbicides, I'm afraid.
What about resistance to the flame or lasers or stuff like that? Is that an issue we need to be thinking about? That Jane follows up with that question.
It is a great question.
I hope not.
Yeah, I hope not either. I mean, right now,
the day the plants take over the planet is when they can fight a lightsaber.
But the classic example that everyone always mentions, of course, the Francois, help me out here. Type it in. It's the rice example, and it is the weed that looks like rice. Anyway, hand weeding rice selects for barnyard grass that looks like rice.
I love that.
Okay. That's sort of the classic example we all learn in weed ecology. And so Jane is right about this too, is that ultimately you're going to be selecting for weeds to survive whatever method that you choose, right? Because of their inherent adaptability, their genetic diversity, and their fecundity.
I love this.
Respect nature.
Yeah, I love this here. We're okay. Jason says, "What? Francois is on this chat. I should be bowing." Well, Jason, that's the kind of audience we have here on the Agronomists. It's a pretty high-end group, so really appreciate everybody tuning in. One of the last questions here from Mike, who says 90% accuracy on optical spot spraying. I don't think it's enough. 2 passes would get you to 99%, but the hours in the sprayer are not free. Is that a gap we got to close, guys?
Mike is right, and so I went to visit with Mike. He has the horse sprayers out in Clearfield, and that's a fantastic sprayer. If you haven't looked it up, we wrote an article on Sprayers 101. But that's kind of the allusion to what I asked Jason earlier. Do we need a different kind of sprayer where the second pass, like what's a pass worth, guys? Is it $10 an acre in fixed costs and variable costs? Is that what it's worth? So, that's not free. right? So that second pass or that 2-pass system has to become less expensive. We have to develop a sprayer that you can do multiple passes at, say, $5 or $4 per acre fixed cost, and plus fuel and so on. That's where we're going with this. And that's why I think the less expensive, lighter, more versatile unit that doesn't have to carry as much water, will have a fit. It'll evolve. It'll come out of this.
Jason, you're like 2 passes. Horticulture, we're like...
Yeah, it's great to be standing on both sides of the line. What horrifies one group just bores the other. But since my quote-unquote coffee is almost gone, that means that my creativity is starting to go up. And all I can picture is a bunch of Boston Robotics dogs dancing through these fields, digging up weeds. It'll be the end of humanity as we know it, as Skylab launches, but I'm still interested to see it.
Beauty. Hey guys, we are out of time. Really appreciate everybody hanging in there with us. I think we did a fairly good job of managing the microphones and the echo that was happening. So I really appreciate you hanging in there and participating. To Jason and Tom, thanks so much for joining us here tonight on The Agronomists.
Thanks, Shaun. Thanks, everybody.
Tom, you did a great job on the phone. That was good. That's the first phone-in caller we've had on The Agronomist. So you're a first for that for sure. Hey, I want to encourage everybody to go to realagriculture.com/agronomist and sign up for our agronomist email. Would really appreciate you doing so. The best part of that is we notify you when you can apply for your CCA credits. Great bunch of thank yous coming in. Earl says thanks. Jason says, wow, awesome learning. Peter says, awesome session all. So some great stuff from the audience as well tonight. Some great questions, high-end questions. It was absolutely fantastic. It's one of the things I love about this show is that the audience brings some great commentary and questions as well. Really keeps our panelists on their toes. Want to encourage everybody, of course, to always check out realagriculture.com. Tom mentioned the sprayer, the horse sprayer. We got a feature on that on realagriculture.com too, where we can hold our own in the sprayer area as well. Hey, thanks so much to everybody for tuning in, and we'll see you again next week. Cheers, everybody.